Wow, it looks kind of alien.
It does. And I actually just realized last week after I cut the window out, from over here it looks a lot like an airplane, I think. The front of an airplane, right? With the windows and the cockpit window.
Why? What are you doing here?
What am I doing? Yeah, no, it's my wife asked me that once in a while too, just to touch base. So I was working in this incubator a couple of years ago, startup incubator with a lot of smart people, and that was the time that the Japanese tsunami happened. I was also working with this astronaut who was in the office, and he was raising funds to try and divert asteroids from hitting the planet, and so he was very interested in tsunamis and their impact. So the same week as the tsunami, he gave a kind of a VC pitch to everyone in the office so we could figure out what was going on, and it was about tsunamis. The whole thing was about how tsunamis wiped out the dinosaurs, and they've struck the planet, and we know very little about them. Everyone was talking about tsunamis, and then the tsunami hit, and so then the whole office was sketching and chatting about, like, what if you knew what would happen? And so at that point, I was doing some sketches. This was one of the first sketches, just trying to figure out relative scale, number of windows, where the hatches were. I liked the sketches, and so I thought, oh, this would be cool. I wonder if I could build that. And so I just started building it. It was that simple. It was not a bigger problem than that. It was just, oh, here's this cool thing. Someone should build it. Maybe I can build it. When I started the design, the first models were all circles. They were all spheres. And then I started to do some research, like, why are there no boats that are spheres? And you quickly figure out that spheres are horrible shapes in the water, right? So then I started figuring out, well, what uses that shape but makes it a sturdier component in the ocean? And there were a whole bunch of like escape modules, escape boats that they would launch off of oil-derricks. And so the design is loosely based on some of that stuff. When I started the design, my biggest concern was weight and the impact resistance. So when I built the framing for the boat, first of all, I don't have a lot of hands or space. So the idea was that I would build this in a very component way so that it could scale and I could build small components at a time and then fit them together like Legos. And so one of the things I did is, you can see there's all these dados in here where this horizontal support meets the vertical support. There's a notch. They're all assembled this way so that in essence you end up with a box which is super strong, and this is a box construction which is super strong. It allowed me to build, this vertical piece all by itself. And so I basically built a whole bunch of these vertical orange wedges and then just put them together. And that way I was able to work in my small shop, build all the components, and then come outside to assemble it. And it also helped me because I wasn't good at figuring out what the final size of the boat was. So like when I built the midship elements, it's basically just a big donut shape. And I just kept building them and sliding them down and epoxying them together. Keep stacking these pieces together until I basically ran out of yard. And then that's how we know how long the boat is. And then you'll notice all of the circles are cut out. They lighten the boat. They don't reduce the strength of the structure very much. They also allow for the flotation foam to be poured in later. That foam will fill those vertical voids. And the idea is that it'll act a lot like a bicycle helmet as far as impact resistance. You'll have this box on top of box, next to box, next to box, sturdy frame, and then you'll have all this flotation foam which will help the impact resistance. And then you'll have an outer hull. And then you'll also have this inner hull, which, because it's almost a complete circle, exerts a very even pressure and makes it a very sturdy shape and impact resistant. So when I showed it to this astronaut friend of mine, he was like, oh, you're building a pressure container, you're building a fuselage. And so for him, it was an airplane part. It was exactly how they would build an airplane part because they have the same issues of pressure.
Wow.
You came about this design not because you were looking at airplanes or even boats? I mean...
Yeah, no, I was just drawing what I thought would be strong shapes and easy to manufacture. And in fact, the first step I did was I tried to make all of the shapes fit on a single piece of plywood so that I could cut it out really efficiently, not have any waste, not spend a lot of money on plywood that was going to turn into sawdust. That's part of how we got this size boat also, which is the components they were able to be cut from 4 by 8 foot sheets of plywood. So it all comes in as full sheets of plywood, so they're all 4 by 8 foot sheets of marine plywood. Ribs are made of 1/2 inch. Most of the stripping on the outside of the boat is this 5mm marine plywood. So before I started building it, I tried to figure out what material I would use, and it was steel or fiberglass or wood. Most people build boats out of fiberglass now, but you build a mold for it basically, and then you put the fiberglass on top of it, and there's lots of sanding, and then there's lots of glass that you release into the atmosphere, into the air. And I've got kids, and I'm going to build it in my backyard, and so fiberglass was pretty much out just because it was so terrible to work with. And I also figured if the problem was build something that survives a tsunami, then one of the problems you have to solve is it's got to last a long time on land without care. And metal doesn't do that well, I think. It doesn't weather with rain and stuff. And it's heavy and it's hard to work with. And so wood quickly became where I headed. And because it's marine plywood, it's made in a way that it won't delaminate or come apart in the water. And then these are not permanent structures, but we camp out here with the boys, and so these things, we pull them as doors to keep some of the bugs out. Okay, and then you just use the backs of your feet on these supports, just like stairs. So these hammocks are really handy.
You've slept in here?
Oh yeah, every week we're out here. So my wife's not a big camper, so for her it works out great. I've got 2 boys and 3 hammocks, so the 3 of us sleep out here.
I've heard people using hammocks for small spaces.
Oh yeah, well, and for boats especially, they're super awesome. So they support you, they move with the water. You don't roll out of them because, you know, they've got these side walls. I tend to want to sleep more than 3 people in the boat. I'm pretty sure I could redesign the hammock so that they go crosswise instead of at a diagonal, and so then I could put in, you know, 4 or 5. I'm less optimistic about toilet in here now than I was when I started. I thought maybe the toilet would be a good idea, but the idea of emptying the composting toilet all the time, and it's it's an enclosed space, and the idea is that there's no holes, that it's airtight. So the idea of a composting toilet in an airtight environment is tough. So we might pee in a bucket in here. That might be just as good as it gets. Yeah. I think the idea is to make it cool and comfortable, but keep it as a safe structure more than a house. So when I talked with my engineer friends at the beginning, they all asked, well, let me see the final plans, because I was starting to build, and so they had assumed that everything had been solved. And I told them I know very little about whatever I'm doing, and so it's one step at a time. I only design enough to know what I'm going to do for the next 4 or 5 weeks, and then by the time I'm done with that, I think I'm smarter than when I started. So then the next step, I get to plan again. And I'm super excited about fitting out the interior. The interior, I really don't know what the interior is going to be, but the idea that we're setting hammocks up and we're sleeping in here and bodies are moving around helps me visualize the kinds of problems I need to solve a lot better than had I tried to do it before I'd been inside the boat. You keep having these discoveries. So last week we had people coming over, and I'm also trying to figure out how you get as many bodies in here comfortably with 5-point harnesses, right? Because the boat is designed to handle a tsunami, so it'll roll. And as you roll, you need to be secured to the boat. Now, it's not a forever thing. You don't need to be in a 5-point harness for days, but for a little while you do. So how do you get as many people in those 5-point harnesses as you can? So So as I'm pulling the floor up last week, the bottom of the boat's empty now because I assume that I'm going to put ballast in the bottom. But I could probably solve the ballast problem another way. But just realizing, sitting here with your back against this wall, you could manufacture a chair with a 5-point harness that now gets all the bodies low in the strongest part of the boat. And so the bodies become part of a ballast system. So not as good as dumping, sand or steel in the bottom of the boat, but it probably solves this problem about 5-point harnesses and bodies better than I had thought of before. You want to build one and you want to put 20 people in it. You don't want to build 20 for single people.
Do you consider yourself a prepper then?
No. I don't have food, I don't have water, I don't have backpacks, I don't have guns, I am not a prepper. This is not a desperate attempt to save my family from the dreaded Palo Alto tsunamis that happen every year. But I think it's a serious problem, and I haven't seen a lot that's being done about it, and so I just thought, what a great design challenge to just think it through. And the best way I know how to think it through is to build it. If I were smarter, I would just think it through and be done, but I'm not. So the tools I have are the idea of building and engaging and problem solving as I build, and then that reaches new conclusions, right? The shop is all of the framing work happened in this small space. This is an example of the cove and bead stripping planking that went on the boat. It's got the cove and the bead that fit together and then allow the board to move a bit. So these two just mate together and then they can spin a bit and still seat and offer a really good spot for epoxy to hit. Anyone who builds a canoe owns the bits that you run on your router to make those pieces. I have a master's in fine art in painting. And as an undergrad and a grad, I was always building stuff. So I've always been a builder, but nothing this size. You end up building a lot of your own tools. So you spend your whole life sanding. So like this is a sanding plane, but the curve of the sanding block is exactly the curve that I need to sand the bottom part of the window cutout. The curve changes, right, at every elevation. And so at that elevation, that is the sanding block that I use to straighten out any of the bumps. I've got a cool bendable one that I made. So it's inefficient to build one for every curve. So I made this, and what this does is it flexes. So on the inside of the boat, you can use this to sand stuff away. Well, and some of it's just throwaway, right? Like it's whatever scrap you have lying around, and you're not sure if it's going to work, so you build it out of an old 2x4 and some cast-offs. Sometimes you need what you need, and it's not out there. You spend a long time looking on Amazon trying to find out who has one of these, and you're like, oh, you just make your own. Like $2 worth of materials later, it's done. The plywood is a really interesting material because it tells you where your mistakes are, because it has all these layers to it. That first layer, when you put it on, it's a little bumpy, and so as you sand it down, the plywood lets you know where you've sanded more, where you've sanded less. So like here, you can see this was sanded more here because now we're breaking through the layer underneath that plywood. It's kind of reassuring now that I've done so many layers. It's like paper mache. It's not brain surgery. You're just taking single strips like this and you're just putting them on the boat, right? I mean, you put epoxy on it and then you put it over the boat and then you staple it down, and then you take the next strip and you stick it next to this one and you put epoxy on it, you staple it down. That would be one layer. And then after the whole layer is done, you sand the whole thing down so that it's really beautiful. And then the next week you come back out and then you cover that beautiful layer up with a whole nother layer of strips running in a different direction. And you just keep going and going and going. The other thing that I think is hard is because I've never done it before, each thing you do potentially breaks what you have. So this was just a couple days ago. This piece snapped on me. You just have to come to grips with, the importance of progress and learning over treating it so like it's such a treasured object that you shouldn't do anything to harm it. As these strips move this way, then you're putting this compound curve together, and you're twisting the plywood, and it really doesn't like that. You have to be okay with breaking it in order to make progress. The benefit is when you're putting those pressures into the plywood, you're actually compressing the plywood in ways that makes it strong. So once you get all these layers on, now you have all of this nice banded compression layers that keep the boat really solid. And each task is like a 30-hour task. There's literally 1,000 screws that I use to put this layer on. For each layer, there's 3 layers on now of this 4mm plywood. For each layer, there's 1,000 screws. So you have to put 1,000 screws in, and then you have to take 1,000 screws out. I think even when you design, even if you're not necessarily hands-on, you learn by iterating, right? You design it a bunch of times, but you never start with all the problems solved. You know, you invest yourself in the process so much that then new solutions reveal themselves. You know, like the porthole windows, these openings, they're deep, and so you do a sketch of it, and it looks like you just took a giant drill and drilled a hole. But you can't drill a giant hole. So you have to figure out how to manufacture that with the tools that you have available. So these are all these half-inch bricks of plywood, half-inch plywood. You basically stack your wood at inch and a half, and then you just keep putting it on a router table and cutting the template out and making it thicker and thicker and thicker and thicker. The window was an interesting problem because I never cut a piece out like that before. I've cut this hatch out, but the lines were pretty much parallel, so I could use a power tool to get through them. But because this was polar, because this was a sphere, I couldn't figure out how to use a power tool well. So the structure used to exist, right? It used to be continuous, and it has all this framing in it, which is at some points 10 inches deep. But I ended up cutting it out by hand just because I felt like it was a straighter line. So I ended up having to use this big Japanese hole saw. I drilled a hole, a bunch of holes up here, just enough to get, I had a smaller version of this, to get the smaller version in, and then you stick it in there, and little by little you work it through. And again, you're cutting in a space that looks more like this. I've never built a boat before, and I've never worked with epoxy, and I've never really worked with plywood before. And had I gone to a school about how to build wooden boats, I'm sure I would have figured it all out in a day. Instead, it takes me months to figure it out. That whole idea of design iteration. So I had some cast-offs from an earlier cut that I did. And so I just put something together that might be stairs, but it's just not very space efficient. But you know, you put it together and then it helps you figure out how you do it better. So this was the first one, and it helped me figure out, you know, a better shape for this outside curve, and I can collapse this down a little bit to save a bunch of space, and then there could be storage underneath. Building it the first time helps me figure out how to build it better the second time. So I try and do a lot of quick and dirty first ones so that I don't spend a lot of time building stuff that I don't need. But I do appreciate that when I build it, I figure out how to build it better. And anytime you feel like you've solved a problem well is terrific, right? I mean, that's why we build stuff, that's why we design stuff. When you do it well, it feels great. That's the important thing, right, is making stuff and feeling empowered to make a difference and make a change. I lived in Fukushima for a year, and they had a hard time with the tsunami. All the places along the seaside there that I would go, those were all destroyed in the tsunami. Let's see. So yeah, when it hit, it was pretty tough stuff. Every move is a learning opportunity and an opportunity for disaster. Gotta turn it around first. The thing that's interesting to me is if somebody builds it somewhere and someone else is interested. So like I was interested in, well, how do you solve this problem? And had I looked online and someone had already built one, I personally wouldn't have been motivated to build it. But if I lived somewhere where tsunamis hit and I thought, oh, this is bad, maybe in my weekends I'll build, instead of working on my car, I'll build a boat that can help weather the storm. And someone had already done it, and you saw it, and you could get the plans for it for free, and then maybe you'd build it. So yeah, maybe someone will build and maybe it's not this, maybe someone smarter than me builds something better than this, and then they look at that and say, I'll build that one, not the first one. But maybe you start the ball rolling, and somewhere someone says, well, shoot, this gets easier and easier. Now there's been 5 of these, and so I'll just make one.
Do you want to make it open source?
If anyone wants the plans, let me know. I don't think it's smart enough yet for anyone to get a lot of benefit from what I've done, but they might look at the plans and see where I had difficulties and figure out how to do it better or cheaper. I know nothing about motors. The idea is it would be an electric motor. There we go. I don't have plans for where the engine goes and where the batteries go for the solar-powered motor. So it's possible the batteries for the electric power would just get dropped down into here. They would make for great ballast because they're super heavy. But yeah, boat folks are constantly writing me, telling me that the boat will flip and be horrible. And I agree. If it were hit with a giant wave right now, it would not be good. But after the hull is the final thickness, then I can figure out how to put the keels on and how to do the ballast system. So I just watched Swiss Family Robinson. It was probably one of my favorite movies when I was a kid, and I kind of made this connection between, oh, they made these awesome tree houses, and I'm building this crazy boat, maybe there's a connection there. Okay. And then I started figuring out, oh, we'll put a bathroom and a shower, and we'll, and then I realized, no, the basic premise is that it's a survival mechanism, right? Boat or whatever you want to call it. And so I have to fight this urge to make it a house. Well, and it was rocking, then you'd be so safe in here. You'd be the safest bees in the pod.
There's another one.
There's another one. My boys like to sleep in here every Friday. Now just be careful, don't stand up in it. If you want to get out. I think we'll use it as a room and we'll have fun in it and we'll camp in it. But if I lose the purpose of the design by embellishing it as a place to live, then I kind of have lost the plot. Got it? Get your butt in there first instead of your leg. Back into it. Sit in like a chair. There you go. I'd still like it to be as comfortable as possible, and it has to have beds and chairs and... First boat accident. Whoa! Yeah. It should have some electronics and solar panels. I'm going to do those things.
Bye-bye.
But I have to keep checking myself against, does it serve the purpose of a survival element, survival location. Thinking about my project, I assumed that there would be a lot more derision when I told people what I was doing, but the comment is, oh, that's so awesome! And I'm like, shouldn't people be telling me how crazy I am? And instead, they're just like, oh, the crazier it is, the better it is. This is so terrific. All right, here she goes. She's trying it. Oh, you can do it. I'll hold your hands and then we'll go up together. 1, 2, 3. I think there's an appreciation for people that make physical stuff, but I think if you polled the people around here, that very few of them do it. Do you like my windows? The windows are pretty cool too, right? Big circles. And then if you want privacy, then you can just put it on. All right, let's do it together because they're super heavy. I think it's a great thing to have going on when you're raising kids. I don't think there's a day in their lives where they'll think, oh, if only I could do this thing that's crazy. I think they'll be like, oh, crap. Dad built that freaking boat in the backyard. I think I could do, and they'll fill in the blank with something.